Hello, Karly. Welcome to Narratives of Connection.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for agreeing to come and have a chat about your work and what you do.
That's fine.
So you've given us a bit of a bio that people would have seen at the beginning or on the slides kind of promoting this. Do you want to tell us in your words what is occupying your time right now?
Yes, all of my time and all of my brain space. So I'm hopefully very near the completion of a PhD, and I am researching Eastern Palliative Care's Biography Program. So they're a palliative care organisation in Melbourne, and they offer a biography program that is facilitated by volunteers and that any of their clients can participate in. And for the last 3 years, I've been researching that program, and so that's meant surveying and interviewing different people from involved in that program, and lots and lots and lots of writing.
Yeah. So the PhD, how much of the writing do you think you got left?
I'm technically only editing at the moment, but that was not true today.
Okay.
I was adding things today, but I am in the very late stages editing, which I guess is why I've been adding a few things, because you notice where you could flesh things out a little bit, or add in something new that's just been published or something like that.
Yeah.
So I am very close, but it also still feels like it's quite a long way away because it's so close but not quite there.
Yeah. Well, we're very privileged to be able to talk to you about some of this work, seeing as it's not been published and it's all still being put together.
Yeah.
So for people who don't know, Eastern Palliative Care is a community palliative care organisation in Melbourne. And how long has the Biography Service been going there?
Oh, since 2006. So it's a really established program of theirs that that's been running this whole time, and they've developed it into a really wonderful service.
Yeah, I've certainly heard about that Biography Service from many different sources and how it's been beneficial for people.
Yeah, for sure.
So how did you get to be looking at that Biography Service? How did this come about?
It was honestly a little bit of a fluke. I was in a previous job, through the changes of life that happened. I was working in lifestyle in aged care. So that's where you run the lifestyle and activities programs in an aged care facility. And I really enjoyed many aspects of that, but I was learning more about palliative care at that time, and I felt that might be an area that I'd like to learn more about. And so I was really just exploring what that meant, like what could I do in palliative care, like what the options were. And I stumbled across an ad, and the ad was for this scholarship. So it's a joint scholarship between Latrobe and EPC to do this research. So they very broadly had said that they want research into the biography program, but with no great specification about what that actually meant. So we sort of developed that as we went. So they had an idea, but it was something that the researcher, myself, was then able to sort of come with their own skills and background and all that sort of stuff, and come to it. And so, I was fortunate enough to get that scholarship.
And did anything in your background kind of help with that
progression
of the ideas?
Yes, it's very clear now at this end, bringing it all together, how much my own history has influenced things. And that's because that's my history. That's where my area of interest and knowledge is. But I have to say, I was still kind of surprised about how it all came together. I shouldn't have been, but initially I was. I've had a rather scattered career. My first degree was theatre, and so I trained in theatre production. So I did do some like acting and voice classes and things like that, but my main my goal was to do production elements, and so I did a lot of that when I was doing the degree. And sort of my intention after that was to I don't know, do stage management. I figured I'd start there because I was doing a lot of that, and had the sort of ultimate goal of perhaps one day getting into directing. I really liked bringing all of the elements together in the theatre. And for all my grand plans, they fell in a heap fairly quickly because I unfortunately got a chronic illness probably in that final year of study and didn't know it. And so really pushed through that final year in a way that meant that I totally collapsed the next year and for many years after that. So I've got fibromyalgia. And so that really influenced a lot because theatre is not a good industry for being chronically ill. And so I knew that wasn't something that I could continue with. And so I began to vary things, and I ended up teaching a little bit of theatre at a private university. And from there I went on to do a master's. I have this weird thing where study becomes something that I do when I'm unwell, which sounds weird, I know, but it's because I don't, it hasn't been study that's class-based. So I've been able to really manage it myself and do it all from home or mostly from home. So it's been a kind of a companion in illness. And so I did a Master of Arts in Church Practice, which focused on spirituality and creative arts. And yeah, so that sort of developed that area a bit, and I was interested, and I worked a little bit as a lecturer in art. And got sick again, and all sorts of things like this happened, and that's how I ended up in lifestyle. So I do have a very strong sort of narrative theatre background and interest. I'm also a visual artist, and so I have I guess what really struck me about the ad for this scholarship is the idea of personal narratives and storytelling.
Yeah.
Because I felt that at the time I wasn't necessarily writing my own experience, but it definitely was why I was making art and what I was making art about. So I really connected with it in that way.
And it's often the case, isn't it? You don't really recognize where these skills are going to go or where they come from sometimes, but they lead you to a place where you look back and go, that's actually...
Definitely. And 10 years ago or so when I did my master's, I had the intention that I'd go on and do more study, but sort of put that aside and thought that's not actually going to happen. So there you go. You never know what's going to pop up down the road. Yeah.
And so I'd imagine there's been some quite memorable stories that you've heard from people in terms of making those biographies and what they said to you.
It's been a really wonderful experience. I interviewed people from 4 groups involved in the biography program, so that the clients, or who I call storytellers, that's the role of them in their research. So the clients who tell their story, the volunteer biographers who help facilitate the stories, EPC staff, and carers of past clients. So people who were carers probably around 5 years ago or so. And so that was very intentional. We wanted, because this was the first time this sort of research had been engaged into the biography program, we wanted to be quite, start with a bit of an overview. So part of my thesis includes a bit of a history, description, and a bit of a comparison with other programs that are similar but different. And so I heard stories from those 4 different groups, and it was really interesting to hear both what they had to say and how they had to say it, sort of what they reflected on, and to hear, I mean, the volunteers, they're amazing. Honestly, the volunteers at EPC, they really were amazing, and I was so privileged to hear their stories, particularly from those who are quite experienced. So there's some who've been volunteering for a number of years, and so they've got so many stories, and I could tell that some of them were just almost so grateful just to be able to share them in a way that they felt that they had these wonderful stories about people who came in. And it's very common for people to come into the program or be told about the program and say, no, I don't have a story to tell. Why? It sounds a bit perhaps self-focused or something that they feel a bit uncomfortable about. And if you can sort of convince people enough to stay or to just start the process and just see what it's like, it's amazing how transformative that is, and people really really engage so well with that program and the process so often. I mean, obviously it does vary. Some people take a really long time and some people only get to do 1 or 2 sessions. But the stories of transformation were quite amazing. And hearing how varied the experiences were. So some people really loved just the opportunity to tell their stories, whereas for other people, they began doing things that they might not have otherwise thought about, like planning their own funeral or writing letters to people that they perhaps maybe didn't want to put in the biography, but that they wanted to say to someone personally. So it was really, really fascinating.
And so some of this would have been over COVID as well. I mean, were these more face-to-face interviews that you were doing? Did it have to be changed? Obviously, during COVID, that was a difficult time.
Yeah, it was a mixture, I guess. So I started at the beginning of 2020. So the intention was to do face-to-face interviews. And even when COVID started, I wrote the ethics application sort of assuming that we'd get back to face-to-face much, much quicker than we did, as everyone experienced. And so, we did hope that it would be face-to-face, but of course it ended up being a hybrid. So by the time I began interviewing in 2021, I was able to interview some people in person, and that was mostly the volunteers and some carers. At the time, EPC still had quite strict policies around who could meet face-to-face with clients, understandably.
Yeah.
And so I followed the same rules as the volunteers, and so they were still doing everything online, and so I did the same, so online or phone interviews. So the majority of them were online, a couple on the phone, and a few in person. Yeah.
And do you think that probably meant that they opened up more, because obviously in isolation and going through what they were going through, they probably were so grateful to have someone to talk to?
I think for some of that for some people they were really glad to have something different to do.
Yeah.
For sure. I think it varied though. I honestly think some of the volunteers in particular would have been so happy to do more. Like they were just so on board with the whole idea that they would have, I feel like whatever we'd proposed, they would have gone, yep, we're on board, let's go. I think what really surprised me though was how open carers were with their experience. So because their experience had been earlier, so they'd been carers for past clients, so most of their loved ones had already passed away, probably within the last 2 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so they came with this reflective quality that I don't think they realised they had, but that was quite, some of them I really felt were quite vulnerable with me about what that experience had been for them and for their loved one, whoever that had been. Yeah.
And when people do the biography, I mean, there's various ways of recording that. So did those carers say that they often looked at those pieces of work, or how did they say they interacted with that in their reflections?
That was really interesting. I asked that question quite specifically of everybody, how they interacted with the biography now. So first of all, the very first carer that I interviewed was actually in person, which was really great. And she brought with her her printed the biography. But it was not just the printed biography that EPC gives everyone. So EPC gives all clients 2 printed copies. And they print it out at their office and they bind it. But it's quite simple, it's just a plastic binding.
Yeah.
But they do also provide people with a digital copy. So people can add to it if they want to, and they can reprint it. And she'd added so many photos and she'd had it printed beautifully bound. And it was just this lovely, almost A3 size book that she brought in to show me. And someone else brought theirs in to show me as well. And so some people had quite an attachment to it, but I was really surprised that not many people seemed to return to it very often. And I think there were 2 reasons for that. The carers that I ended up interviewing, quite a few of them had done extra work. So 2 of them in particular, they had added lots more photos. One lady had added like another 300 photos. So,
Wow.
yeah, she'd put a lot of work into that already. And there was another carer who had really engaged with the biography in the writing of her eulogy for her mother. So those carers in particular had really, really already engaged with the biography quite a lot. And I almost got the feeling that they knew it so well that they didn't feel that need to return to it very often. But they all said, I know that I could if I wanted to.
Yeah.
And, so I felt it had that almost like that reassurance that they knew where it was. They knew that they could if they needed to. And when they needed to, they were able to do that. But it wasn't something that many of them regularly returned to.
And I know in biography services, I mean, there can be recordings, so audio recordings, or it could be a video as well. Did many people have those?
Yeah, EPC at the moment is all text-based. I think, so they've just brought in new policies where they do provide some audio. And I know that there has been an instance where someone's biography was audio recorded for them, like an audio book, because they were blind. And so it meant they could listen to their story. Pardon me. But video isn't part of the service at the moment. I know that other places do that. But that's not to say that that's not going to happen in the future. I think
I mean, the generations now, there's so many pictures, so many videos being taken. It would be a bit of a surprise if they didn't transpose into, some sort of biography of this person's life.
Yeah, pardon me. I think that there will be quite a few developments in the near future. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And just in thinking about some of those people who sort of said, "Oh, my life there's nothing spectacular.
I've got nothing to tell."
Yeah, nothing to tell. Are there can you share any of those stories where they said they had nothing to tell and then suddenly you found a gold mine of information?
Well, I think the truth is that everyone does have some story to tell, just because everyone has relationships and connections and they've done something. I think, so there was a great story that I read. I didn't get to interview the person, but I read a couple of biographies so that I'd learn sort of about what was produced. There was one great one about a man who'd been a dancer, and so it was all about his professional career as a dancer and his travels around the world. There are stories that I've read that are perhaps not so grand in what they say, but the nuance is quite beautiful. The people who write about their families, there were some really lovely stories about growing up with their kids. And then there's some amazing things about people's very early life. So quite a few people have written about their earliest memories and the changes in lifestyle between then and now, particularly people who are, in their 80s and 90s. It's just so dramatic, the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I probably didn't phrase that well because everyone's got stories, whether they're great or not, it depends on who's listening.
It does.
To them and the relationship they have to them.
Yeah, and it was quite interesting that people would tell their story quite differently depending on what they were focusing on. So that was nice to see as well. Yeah. And
did you see many families coming together? Because sometimes these are stories that people haven't spoken with their children or their grandchildren. Or if it's a younger person, the parents or grandparents.
Yeah, there was a variety of that. I think of the storytellers that I interviewed, I think just by the nature of being prepared to be interviewed, they were people who found the experience mostly beneficial, and without too much stress in their life already. So generally people would say that they found it very helpful, that it perhaps opened up conversations, with grandchildren, with children, that it was an opportunity to talk about their early life before they'd had children, and particularly grandparents who said it was really great for their grandchildren to get to hear that they were real people and not just grandparents. So there was that. I think there were also stories that were perhaps more themed in a way. Some that really focused, say, on travel, or all the different countries that they'd visited. And there was one man I heard of who was very intent on writing quite a detailed professional history, and that did actually cause some problems because he didn't get to complete the process. He did die before. They might have continued if he hadn't died. And his wife wasn't sure if he was going to go back and add in more stories about the family, if he was just really intent on that professional career, and if he would have gone back and add in more later. And she did say that the children were a little bit they were a bit surprised that they weren't really mentioned very much at all. So there were a few things like that, and there was one quite dramatic, very dramatic one where the story had included some secrets from childhood, and no one had been aware of that until it was included in the biography. And then, so the carer who was telling me about it, he included that in the eulogy, and so it caused quite a ripple through that family. But that wasn't common.
And do you think you were already doing a little bit of this with the lifestyle work in aged care? I mean, getting to know people and getting to hear their stories and making them feel heard, seen, understood.
Definitely. And I think that was definitely the connecting point, doing that job, that role. And partly it was going, I see how valuable this role is, but I also know how limited I am in the time, and feeling quite constrained. I mean, I understand many people in healthcare would feel that. I know a lot of nurses, they express the feeling that they didn't feel like they could spend enough time with clients talking about their story, and so they were glad for the biography program to offer that as a service. And I felt a little bit like that in that lifestyle role, that as much as that was what we were there to do, there could have been so much more, and that there were greater opportunities. And so it was really nice to be able to sort of extend that into this research.
Do many of the staff also have their stories integrated into some of because obviously the person may be talking about their lives, but also you might hear that they've spoken to a nurse about another part of their life, and the nurse might come to you and say, or may come to the volunteer and say, oh, this was a story they told. Have you got that in the story?
There's not so much that sort of crossover. I found that in the life storytelling process, if people wanted to be pretty detailed, they were. If they thought of things, or if there were other things, they tended to bring them back to the story. I think for staff, it was more that staff would hear them start to tell something and say, you've really got something that sounds really interesting. We've got this program where you could go into that in a lot more depth. And that was where either people would go, oh, that sounds really great, I'd really like to. Or sometimes there needed to be a little bit more convincing of saying, no, I don't think I actually have a story to tell. And quite a few staff said, if someone said that initially, we'd okay, that's fine, but would perhaps come back around to it later on and see if they'd thought about it a bit and, I don't know, got used to the idea.
So there was a springboard to introducing the service. And I suppose definitely. For confidentiality issues, that there may well be just keeping that to where the person wants to talk about, rather than sharing a story out of context with the program.
And there are also other opportunities like that. EPC have family support workers, so that's more, they can engage more in a therapy type talking if they want to as well. But again, that's optional. So there are sort of various avenues that can be picked up. and they all work in a way that they know that, I mean, all staff and all volunteers know about the Biography Program, and there's a very open policy and referral. So if anyone thinks that they might be interested, they can bring it up and say, that sounds really great. Do you want to talk about it a bit more?
Mm.
Offer the service.
Yeah, in services I've worked in before where there maybe hasn't been a biography service or that opportunity to talk to someone in that way. That's where some of the family support workers, social workers, spiritual care workers, medical and nursing to a degree as well, and would hear some of those stories and try and hopefully enable them to be heard a little bit more. I mean, it was part of that, making that person feel valued
definitely
in their life, and encouraging them to tell the stories if they want to.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when you think about wrapping this all up, what do you think the next steps are going to be?
Oh, for me or for the program?
Well, I think the program will continue. It may well be have more ways to develop from the information you provide. But what do you think will be the next steps, or have you not thought that far ahead?
Look, it's really hard. At the moment, I'm in that space of having both so many ideas of what could happen and also not quite knowing what to do with any of them. So I guess I'm looking around, seeing what's available. I've got a list of, future research that could be done or avenues and areas. But I'm definitely the area of combining spirituality, storytelling, creativity, those three areas, particularly within palliative care, but also healthcare more generally, are definitely areas that I'd like to stay connected in with, however that perhaps pans out. Yeah.
And has that spirituality come from your upbringing and maybe a belief in a certain faith, or has it been something you've developed as years have gone by and recognized the spirituality in your life?
Well, both. I've grown up in a Christian household, and that's definitely my basis and founding. But it's also something that I've engaged with myself as an adult, and I guess that experience of having a chronic illness was something, and particularly that really challenged what I believed and how I thought about it in particular, and how I engaged in life in general. And it continues to have a pretty big influence on how I think about what's important and what I'm prepared to put time and energy into, because I'm somewhat constrained by the limitations of a chronic illness and energy wise. And so that has made me really consider and think about what I find important in my life, and how I live that out in life and work and everything. So it's definitely something that I've spent a lot of time on myself as well as an adult. Yeah.
And certainly would have given you an insight into some of the way that people were expressing their feelings about their illness as well.
Yeah, and I have to say that was one thing that I actually found quite surprising about the research, because when I came into it, I mean, I guess one of the areas I started reading first was about illness narratives, and I immediately, I had a great connection with that and understanding. I was like, this is, the more I read about it, the more you find more language and more people who have written about them in really interesting ways. And I assumed that would be something that came through the research quite strongly, and it didn't.
Right.
And I think what that was about was that it was very present, but sort of not overtly. So a lot of people chose very deliberately to not write much about their ill health. The caveat of that is if people had already had a long-term chronic illness. So if people there was one man, I interviewed his wife, he had had MND for a long time. And so that experience of living with the life-changing experience of that, he wrote quite a lot about that. But then I also read a biography, a lady who had cancer, and that was her diagnosis at the time of writing. And right at the end, she wrote that she'd been diagnosed 3 times previously, and she hadn't included that at all in her story. And so I found that a lot of people focused their storytelling very strongly on those positive aspects. It's not that they ignored things that were difficult, but it was less overt in their storytelling, I found, a lot of the time. Sometimes it was included sort of just at the end, this is what I'm experiencing now. But a lot of that reflection was more on early life or life before that disruption of diagnosis, which I found quite interesting. And I think there's more research that could be done in that area for sure.
I suppose also thinking about who is going to be reading this and who are they leaving it for, and leaving
Definitely.
them with certainly the impressions that they wanted to.
Definitely,
leave.
That was huge impact. So it's actually quite a different audience and intention to illness narratives. This type of legacy leaving. So that I guess one of the things that sort of adds to this is that as much as people were writing a legacy document, and so there's the ideas of audience and who are you writing for and what are you wanting to leave, within the storytelling process, people are able to share whatever they want. And then if that story, they decide that they don't want to include that story, they can just cut that out.
Yeah.
And so potentially within those storytelling moments, they are sharing a lot more that then doesn't come into that final product. So again, there's an interesting tension there that the volunteers spoke about quite a lot, and the things that they've been told that they were then told, no, don't include that.
Yeah.
Or the people who start with, I'll tell you, but don't tell anyone else, sort of thing. So there's a really interesting dynamic there.
A process of providing that information, but then editing it back according to how they felt about that. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
And the artwork that you have produced, I noticed some of the artwork in the background there. So how did your art come into play with the work you've been doing?
So my own artwork hasn't been specifically part of the research process, but it has been quite a creative process in that it's been very narrative focused. So I used a narrative methodology. It was all based around storytelling. And how that has resulted is that, first of all, I've structured my thesis into 3 acts, so Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. But the reason that I chose to do that was because one of the surprising things that came out of this research was that when I was engaged in analysis, part of the analysis process was developing research poetry. And so I was drawing from the transcripts with interviews, sort of distilling them down into shorter sections. And that process was making me think about, obviously it was making me think about poetry. It was part of a broader analysis process. It's not just about that research, poetry, but it made me think about the concept of performance and what happens in that process of distilling things down to that very personal voice of the interviewee. And as a result of that, I began playing around with the concept of research poetry and then with script writing. And so in my Act 3, there are a couple of examples, and they are only examples because I don't have the time to properly workshop them the way that you would a proper theatre show. But there are some drafts of potential performances that draw on interviews, participants' stories, but that transform them so that they're not identifiable, but that still draw on their same themes and stories to tell the story of the biography program and of palliative care more generally.
Yeah.
And I particularly focused on the carer interviews for this, partly because I needed to contain that process to one group, because for each group a different process would be required, and that starts getting really complicated and requiring much more time than I had. but also the carers came with, as I said before, that really reflective quality. And I found that most of the carers came not just to tell me about the biography program, but they told me their whole palliative experience with them and
Yeah.
their loved one.
Yeah.
And so I got these fantastic entire stories, and I was like, what? They tell such an amazing story of palliative care and of storytelling and of grief and of all sorts of things. And so I wanted to explore how they might then be transformed from that private setting into a public setting that perhaps maybe might prompt more conversation about palliative care or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so
we've
that
just
was,
had Palliative Care Week.
yeah.
So that sounds like something that would be very powerful for a Palliative Care
Yeah,
Week next year, potentially, or in the
yeah,
future.
yeah. So things like that, little performances, or different sorts of things that are able to, really invite greater conversation about that in the public. Mm.
And from those different areas as well, like you said, from the patients themselves or the people themselves, the carers reflecting, and
Yeah,
then obviously the volunteers who are so
definitely.
integral to the service as well.
Yeah, and so that's something. I mean, if I guess you're asking before what my next steps were. I guess if I could do absolutely anything in the world, it would be to really explore that theatre writing aspect of probably interviewing more people and then taking their stories and transforming them into something that invites other people into what is quite a private experience and something that people don't know about a
Yeah.
lot or don't feel comfortable with, and of trying to make that seem just more part of life, I guess, and
Mm.
something that's worth talking about. Yeah.
That sounds like an exciting venture to move into. I was just
Yeah.
thinking then, how much do you think it would benefit people in aged care having a biography service of the same sort of
Oh,
nature?
definitely. I think it'd be wonderful. I think this is a sort of service that can translate very well into other services. And part of what my thesis contains is so so I began by describing the history and how the program operates compared to how maybe some other programs operate. And out of that, I realized that as much as I could describe how it actually operates for EPC, there was probably going to be greater worth in describing the philosophy that they work by. So rather than expecting people to adhere to how EPC does it exactly because it fits within their organisation, what are the underlying philosophical elements that they draw from that could then be adapted into almost any organisation? And so I describe it as a person-centred program that is relationally based, that believes in lifelong learning and the ability to develop, and that it is inherently creative. And so as part of that, I use the metaphor of a theatre. This is all very theatre based, and I've tried to theme everything. But I describe a theatre, no, I describe the biography program as a theatre company to explain how I see it as not just a program that has creative elements in that storytelling and the editing of the volunteers and things like that, but it's pretty much an inherently creative program in that you can't just say this is how it runs. You have to say this is how we will facilitate it and we will adapt it to the needs of the person that we're working with. And within that relationship, particularly between the storyteller and the volunteer, they're very good at adapting to what is needed by that patient, the storyteller, in that moment. Yeah.
And were there stories from the volunteers about the relationships that were built up? So in the UK, for example, there's something called Compassionate Neighbours, where volunteers, they may well have had a lived experience, I think, and they spend time with people from who have got a life-limiting illness. And I think that they were allocated a certain length of time to spend with them. But as time went on, as they were seeing them and supporting them in the community, they would spend more time,
Mm.
and obviously the relationships built. So was there
Mm.
anything in the voices of the volunteers when they talked about the relationship they built with the patients, but also did the carers talk about some of those volunteers who came and did the service from their perspective?
Yes. Almost 100% sort of appreciation of the volunteers.
Yeah.
A few stories of where there had been a few issues, but they were definitely in the minority. Carers and patients were so grateful for their volunteer and for how they worked with them. One of the carers in particular, she really described the volunteer as becoming a friend of her mother, and there was a great sense of friendship developing amongst many of the stories. And a lot of the volunteers said that the reason that they continue to volunteer is because of the relationships that they get to build, and the fact that they just love going and hearing everyone's stories and communicating with them and all that sort of stuff. The interesting thing is that EPC has quite for various reasons, they have quite a strict policy about ongoing contact, in that once the biography is completed and delivered, that there's not to be any more contact between the biographer and the patient. Once the patient has died, they inform everybody, and volunteers are able to go to public funerals if they're open and those sorts of things. But to protect the volunteers, they have this policy because, and I mean, I understand why that is, because I've read other studies that, talk about the over-reliance on volunteers, and so they're very keen to look after their volunteers. But even within that time frame of whatever the biography program process takes, wonderful relationships are created, and they definitely become, like, from my perspective, the friend that patient needs at that time.
Yeah.
And because they're telling their stories and they're sharing, there was just, some great relationships built. And EPC is very, as I said in the philosophy, the program is relationally based. And that is not only between the patients and volunteers, but between the volunteer services staff and the volunteers. So they know and support their volunteers, and that's very important to them. And so they know when they get a new client referral, someone wants to join the biography program, they really consider who might be the best volunteer for that person. And so I had quite a few of the clients say, I was really surprised about how well we got on, and we had all these similar experiences in life. And even one lady who said, we both lived in the same country overseas for a while. And they were like, I don't know how they chose such good people, but it's because they are very deliberate in that process of trying to really work out who would be really suitable for that person. And they managed to just do that so well, so often.
Yeah. And was there much cultural diversity in the group of people that you spoke to?
Not massively, unfortunately. Because we really didn't know going into it what the response would be, particularly for the carers and for the patients. We really couldn't. We wanted to be very careful of their time. We didn't want to put too much burden on patients, all that. And so I admit to not putting a lot of effort into that, because I simply didn't know who was going to respond. And so I felt like I needed to just take who volunteered first. And so it was pretty much on a first come, first serve almost basis. And that needed to happen, particularly for patients. I didn't get that many more volunteers than I interviewed. But also unfortunately, there's not a massive cultural diversity within the clients of EPC, but it is developing, and EPC is working on developing their diversity for volunteers. And so at the moment, they've got a massive push looking for people in particular who speak languages other than English, because that's something they don't have at the moment, but that they really want to. But trying to match up what they need with what they have
Yeah.
is also can be a bit tricky. But that is definitely an area that more research could be done in. The thing that I think is most interesting about that is because the biography program is facilitated and doesn't follow a strict process, as in it doesn't stick to a particular set of questions. How it's facilitated, lots of different options. The volunteers are trained in different ways that they could facilitate biographies, but they work with the client to work out what the client wants to do and how they want to tell their story. So it's very adaptable. And so from my perspective, I would see that as being very culturally adaptive, because they could go into any number of people and say, what is important to you and how would you like to tell your story? And however the client responds, the volunteer is probably going to go, sure, how can we make that happen in a way that honours your life? So I see the cultural adaptability as being very good, but just not specific in the research, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just having a think there when you were talking about that diversity. I think the question's just gone from my mind. It'll come back to me.
Sorry,
maybe.
I talk too much.
No. That's usually something that's thrown at me in terms of talking. In terms of aged care, do you see many volunteers going into aged care? Just on this idea of if that was translated over to an aged care kind of setting.
Do you mean just sort of generally, or specifically?
Yeah, just generally.
Generally, yeah. I have to say that from my experience of working in aged care, not massively. And again, I think that's because the people who would be organising that are the lifestyle people, which I was one of, and the time it takes to find, recruit, train, make sure they're suitable, all that sort of stuff, as EPC will tell you, is extensive. So the reason that EPC have this amazing volunteer program, like they have like 100 volunteer biographers on their books or something extraordinary like that. The reason they can do that is because they've got this dedicated staff. And I've never seen that in an aged care facility.
Yeah.
Maybe it is. It's not that I've seen every aged care facility, but I have never seen that sort of setup in any aged care facility. But I think it would be so worthwhile, because if the initial money was spent on hiring staff, I think that would pay off in what they could help their volunteers do. I mean, where I worked, the last place that I worked, we had some wonderful dedicated volunteers, but they'd been there for many, many years, and they'd started volunteering because they'd known people who had been there and then continued.
Yeah.
And we simply didn't have, I mean, just as one example, we had a church service that would come in and provide a service, and then the church stopped and they were no longer able to provide that. And even trying to find someone else to come in took such a long time.
Yeah.
For something that was very specific and sort of part of the role of a community church.
Yeah.
And to do that more widely, it would take a lot of work. I think it'd be worth it, but it needs to be very intentional, and it really has to be have space made for.
Yeah. I've just remembered the question that I was going to ask you, because it seems to me that the feedback that the service could get from people telling these stories, obviously stories about their lifetime will be one aspect. Like you said, there's that health narrative as well, and their perspectives on the service that was provided to them, whether it was in the community or in the hospital setting. Do you think this could be something that could be utilized in the future for some of those views to be fed back to the service so that they can improve their service? Because you would get some people who would be saying, look, I think this didn't work well, and this needs to be looked at. is there a mechanism at the moment? Just obviously with that confidentiality, there may not be that mechanism, but is there some way in the future you think that would be able to be fed back to services?
Yeah. So do you mean this sort of research specifically, or the performance-based sorts of things? Is that?
I think in the discussions that we have with people, whether it's carers who have had that bereavement process and they have this ability in this kind of research to feed back about the services, but also volunteers and what they hear the client say, or what the client may say themselves. Because we have these surveys that are done, and there's usually a very poor uptake, and you will get people who will speak up who maybe have something to say, which is not necessarily representative of the whole group of people that were looked after. So, is this an opportunity, you think, of us kind of having more depth to that and feeding back?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably, if I can remember, in two ways, I think it would. So I found that people were willing. The cat has joined me. This is Saffron.
That's okay. Hi, Saffron.
So I found that yes, the people who were prepared to volunteer or to participate in the survey were predominantly those who had good experiences and so wanted to sort of almost give back by participating. But I think also there were a few who wanted to specifically say a few things that they thought could be improved.
Yeah.
Even if overall they thought the program was great, there were a few people who were very, they really wanted to give their feedback.
Yeah. And
I think that there is the opportunity because, the interview process is so, and it was deliberately so, it was so similar to the biography process that when you invite people to sit down and tell stories, as you will know, if you create a situation that is not overwhelming or making people feel like they've done something wrong, I find that people become really open quite easily. Not easily, but some people won't tell you everything, of course. But I think that there is a greater opportunity for that real face-to-face conversation to get in-depth stories. And I think in-depth stories highlight issues. Like if one person tells you something, someone else will have had something similar, even if it's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely that element. I think within EPC, because of the good relationship between the EPC volunteer staff and the volunteers, they're very open to feedback immediately from volunteers, and they're very keen to work with their volunteers to improve things, to take suggestions, all that sort of stuff immediately. I think that part of it, this is just me talking perhaps off the top of my head, but I sometimes think that part of the issue with receiving feedback about programs, and I think I did find this when I worked in lifestyle as well, is that some of the issues that are raised, while some things can be dealt with immediately, you often know what those things are. The things that can be dealt with easily, you know immediately, you already know what they are. It's often more the philosophical approach to care or something that these stories tell you that can't be fixed immediately, but that through hearing the stories, you begin to hear of more overarching things of perhaps why larger things aren't working. Yeah. And I think that's how the storytelling and the creative narratives and all that sort of thing is really beneficial, because you do get to hear that overarching narrative. And you not only find out why that one thing didn't work, but why the experience was difficult and how the relationships added to that and all those sorts of things. And I guess that's really what I found in the pieces that I've tried to work into, draft theatre scripts, is that because they tell that overarching story, you can see that it's not any one thing or any one person often.
Yeah.
It has more to do with approaches to care or structural difficulties and all that sort of stuff, which are a bit more difficult to address because it takes a lot more restructuring or approach or re-education or whatever it is that's needed. I think I answered the question.
I think it's a good answer to that question. Yes.
That's good.
I think with all the research you've done, what advice would you give to people about how they can best support people to hear their story?
I think the key thing would be that if you want to hear someone's story, or if you want to invite them into a space of storytelling, you just need to allow them to tell that story. And the reason that I say that is because when I asked people if they appreciated having a volunteer work with them, who was essentially a stranger who walked in almost off the street, and before COVID, and again now, the volunteers go to clients' houses, unless they're doing it online, obviously, but they go to them wherever they are. So they're not only just meeting with a stranger, they're inviting a stranger into their home. And I know that that's how EPC works because they work in the community. But it might be, for some people, it might be a bit different having a nurse come into your home than having, who is this person? What are they here for? They're here to hear your story. But people seem to get over that quite quickly. The volunteers seem to be very good at making that a comfortable space and of allowing people to talk. And what clients and carers would most often say was that because they were a stranger, I was more prepared to say things that I might not have been prepared to tell my family, or that I know my family have heard before and don't want to hear again. And so there was that really interesting dynamic of that they were just prepared to take the story, whatever came. And there's no judgment. You could tell them anything and they'd go, that's fine, or that's terrible, but it's fine that you've told me, or whatever that is. And so I guess that comes down to that process of just being really non-judgmental and allowing the stories to be told however they wish to tell them, perhaps even if they're not entirely accurate at times, but that they are the memory of that person. I mean, maybe you want to go back and fix up dates later on, but in that initial telling, if it's a bit not quite right, let it be not quite right. That's okay.
That's part of being human. Yeah.
And they might, I found a lot of people clients would say that they'd get to the end of the session and go, what did I say? I don't think I told you that right. But it didn't matter at the time. They can fix it up later. It was the process of telling that was important and enjoyable for them. Yeah.
I think we see that. I think the thing that the volunteers have is that there's no power differential.
Yes, definitely.
Obviously, a health professional coming in can create that. But we've noticed this with students coming into the hospital or into the palliative care units.
Yeah. And I think also, as well as that non-professional, people don't feel like they're taking up their time as much.
Yes. Yeah. So we would often say, go and talk to this person. And because they haven't necessarily learnt the structure of, let's say, a medical consultation or whatever, they would just sit and listen.
Yeah.
And the person would be able to speak. And they'd come back with a whole heap of information. And sometimes they'd come back with information that none of the team had ever picked up because there was no power differential and they had allowed the person to speak. And they would then say, I don't know if this is important, but...
Yeah, exactly. And EPC finds the same thing because the volunteers are part of their interdisciplinary team. If the volunteers hear something that make them concerned or worried, or that they're like, you might want to tell the nurses that, they're able to either encourage the patient to do that or to go back to EPC and say, look, I think this is really important. You need to know this. And so that does mean that there's an extra, and some of the staff said this, that they feel like the volunteers are an extra set of eyes in that situation. And they're able to find out probably more about the family situation, about how they actually feel, in a way that perhaps the nurses don't get to hear because of that, that different relationship, for sure.
That reminds me, I've only seen this once in a hospice in Auckland. The chef of the kitchens was part of the multidisciplinary team meeting.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I saw the person there, I was thinking, they delivered the morning tea and we were getting ready for the meeting, and they sat down.
They stayed,
And what was invaluable was obviously they would know that the person wasn't eating, there was something changing, the family were really struggling. They'd talk to them as they brought the food in. They were obviously taking orders as well. I mean, it was just another great insight into how a team can work together and support people. And that was a wonderful way through food.
That's great.
Nutrition.
And I've seen in aged care as well that people, carers or family who get chatting to staff in the dining room or after dinner or something like that, and are much more open about how they think their family member is going in that relationship. So I think that's great.
Yeah. Well, Karly, thank you so much for your time this evening. And I really look forward to reading your PhD and seeing what work comes out of it. No pressure.
No, me too. I'm really excited for that.
I'm sure it'll be immensely valuable. And I think also the powerful stories that you will kind of condense and use in some form will be a great way for us to just highlight the great work that's being done out there, and full credit to EPC for taking this up those years ago and running with it and making it a really powerful part of hearing people's stories that everyone can hear. Well, certainly their families and can hear, but also the opportunity of sharing some of them in a different way with your research is another great opportunity.
Yeah. It was a great opportunity, and they've trusted me a lot with it, so hopefully they're pleased as well. I think so far.
Yeah, I'm sure they will be, and I'm sure they'll be very proud of the work you've done. So thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you for having me. It's my first time guesting on a podcast.
Pleasure. That's right, because you have a podcast as well, don't you? Or you're part of one?
Yeah, we're part of, Krystal and I, Krystal from EPC. We've recorded 5 of our 6 episodes that we plan to do. 3 are released already, 2 more to come, and then another final one. Yeah, so that's just a short series about the research. Yeah.
So what's the podcast called?
Once Upon a Story.
Once Upon a Story. So available at all podcast outlets.
Well,
right?
Nearly all podcasts. Podbean in particular. I had a few issues because I'm doing lots of it myself. I had a few issues connecting with Spotify, I think it was. But yes, I should give you that link as well.
All right. Yes, we'll. If you give us the link, we'll put it in the notes for this. But thanks so much. Great to hear about your work, and look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Take care.